Today is all about accessibility, and hopefully we'll have some interesting insights for you when it comes to testing digital accessibility. So in the next round about half an hour, we'll talk a bit about testing strategies and try to share some background information and some experience from our side. There will also be time for questions at the end, but if you do have questions, feel free to post them in the chat whenever you want. We'll collect them and then try to go through all of them after the initial presentation. We will also be recording the session and share that afterwards. You can have a look again if you want to. And having said that, we'll just get right into it. So we'll start with introductions so you know who you're talking to or who's talking to you. My name is Marcus. I'm one of the co-founders here at TestBirds, and I am very much interested in all things accessibility, but I don't know as much as Marcel does, and that's why he's here. So Marcel, maybe you can introduce yourself real quick.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for being here together with you. So I'm Marcel, one of the co-founders of A11YPLAN. So we are taking care of covering accessibility with a plan. So presenting you something about this later on in the session. As I have a lot of experience, long year experience in UX design, front-end development, and also with regards to accessibility already for some years. And this experience, we want to bring in and share with all of you and with others using our tool and our approach. So thanks for being here.
Nice to have you. So let's get into it. We'll start with the basics. Why digital accessibility, or what is digital accessibility? Basically, what we're trying to do here, us, hopefully also all of you and everyone working on that topic, is to make sure that digital experiences are accessible and also understandable to all, no matter where they come from, what abilities they have, what their situation is. Right. So it's inclusiveness is basically the topic here. And to give you some background information, this topic affects a lot of people. So it's not just a niche topic, but there's more than 1.3 billion people worldwide living with a permanent disability, and even almost double that amount of people using assistive technologies. Right. So, for example, we'll talk about screen readers also in a moment. The issue with this is that more than 90% of websites in this case, so one specific digital product, are still not barrier free, so not accessible to all of these people. And that's a lot, right? So you can imagine someone with a disability surfing the web, going to different websites. They typically encounter a lot of issues. And we'll have some examples what that could look like later on in the presentation. What's also important to realize is that we're not only talking about permanent disabilities, right? So when we talk about accessibility, we also need to consider temporal or situational topics. And I think a lot of us have experienced that also ourselves. For example, when you sit outside, when it's nice and warm and it's sunny, you sit in front of your laptop or you use your smartphone, and then it's very bright and you have trouble seeing what's going on, right? And then you might actually use some functionality or features that are intended as accessibility features, because you zoom in, you increase brightness or contrast and things like that. Or maybe, you know, you had an operation, you have limited mobility at the moment. You maybe had eye surgery and then you have trouble seeing, and then you also need to make sure, or you want to make sure, that you can use certain products still the same way that you were using it before. Right. So in addition to kind of the numbers that we just saw, there's also a lot more people that use accessibility features temporary or depending on their situation. Now, Marcel will show a couple of examples what that looks like kind of on a daily basis.
Yes. So as it's quite difficult to explain the experience for blind people, I also brought an example that you maybe can feel also as sighted people. So this is a common and very often happening issue here. with a form with missing labels, so missing description. So if you can see on the left side is basically the same form, you easily understand where to enter which kind of information, for example, your first name, your last name. But if you are blind and if you require assistive technology, for example, a screen reader who reads out actually the fields you currently selected, for example, here the first name, and it's not described appropriately, you will just read out, like here in the screenshot, required edit text field. And this is the same for all the fields. So actually, because it did not implement it correctly, how does it feel for blind people? They basically see just a form with a lot of fields, but they do have no idea where to enter which information, which basically is a very heavy barrier because they cannot fill out the form and, for example, get in contact with you. That's one of the examples for screen reader technology. The second one is more about the visual appearance, so also the temporary disabilities or maybe older people. Because older people with glasses, they usually require the possibility to increase the text size. But this is also requiring a technical correct implementation of your website, because here's one example of a dealer where we turned on the text increment, the text zoom, but as you see nothing, so the text is actually not increased. So it's also not accessible for the people who require this. Another example, same setting, is also the zooming. Yeah. So there, it is actually implemented for the text, that the text size is increasing when you set the zooming functionality in your browser or with the device, but unfortunately, the layout itself is not built for responsive design. So you see that the text is increasing, but still you have a lot of overlapping. So context is cut off or text is cut off. You cannot read it anymore and you cannot use it anymore. And interestingly, for example, some images are decreasing in size if you increase the size. So it's also a sign for a bad implementation. And another example also, Marcus mentioned this for if you're surfing in the sun, so with sun blinding, this is also affecting. There is also a special mode for people with disabilities, so they can turn on the high contrast modus, which is not the same as the dark modus, but a very specific modus for your device. And this is basically setting a specific color scheme. But again, if you're not aware of this and you implemented this incorrectly, this could result in even a bad experience than before. For example, in this case, all of the links, all of the brands, all of the images are disappearing and you see just a black screen when turned the modus on. So these are just some examples, and we want to point out why and where these problems arise. So a lot of our clients and contacts we talk with, they mostly think in the first set of the visual appearance. So color contrast of buttons, of text, for example, but this is only really a small part. Of course, it's really important also when talking about accessibility, but you have to be aware, especially for these assistive technologies, that there is a lot to take care besides of just the visual appearance, especially if you keep in mind that blind people cannot see. So for example, a simple button, which is a box with a text, an icon, a color, is way more than just these box if you implement this and if you want to implement this correctly. There's of course a visual text, but we have alternative descriptions. So we have to read out what is the element about, so that it is a button and what happens if you click on the button. We have to set the right role, we have to set the right structure, and we also have to take care of different states. For example, the focus state. If you access a control by keyboard or with assistive technology, you do not have a cursor and a mouse. You need to see where you're currently located, which is the focus state, disabled state, loading states. So there's a lot of dimensions that you have to take care of when talking, and if you want to build accessible products that do not face and bring up these problems that we just saw in the examples.
All right. Let's talk about the legal basis, or some of the legal basis at least, because I think there's a lot of different people in the call. And when we look at the kind of the topic globally, then there's also a lot of legislation in different countries when it comes to accessibility. We're currently, myself at least, we're currently located in Germany. Some of you might be in some of these countries, but especially in Europe, we have the so-called European Accessibility Act coming up, which then goes into effect this summer, end of June. And this will affect a lot of companies, and all of the countries in the European Union have now implemented this kind of in their own respective way. But the legal basis is the same for all of them in Europe. And then you see some of the other examples in the US, Canada, for example, also in Australia, and so on. What we talk about now has a background with a focus on the European Accessibility Act. So I'll share, or we wanted to share, kind of who's impacted by that topic. And this is a simplified view maybe, but generally you can say if you're doing B2C topics, and you either have more than 10 employees or more than 2 million in revenue, then you're affected by the European Accessibility Act, and you need to be accessible, or your product, your digital product, needs to be accessible. Maybe as a side note, it's not only for digital products, but and also includes some offline product topics, but we're now focusing in this webinar only on digital products. So what does that mean exactly? It means that to be accessible or to adhere to that law, you need to comply with the WCAG standard. And there, that's the WCAG 2.1, but it's also something that has been there before the European Accessibility Act, and it's also something that's constantly evolving. So, they're already working on a kind of an update, version 2.2. You can already use that, and there will be more going forward. And the WCAG is divided into 3 layers. You have kind of the basis, which is the A layer, and there you have the 29 criteria that cover, let's say, the basics. And then you have the double A standard, which adds another 19 criteria. And that's also the standard that's required by law now, or end of June. So you need to comply or realize the 29 from version A or level A, and the additional 19 from the double A, to comply with the European Accessibility Act. There's also then the third one, which is AAA, and in some areas that might make sense, but to really get to AAA, there's a lot of effort involved, and probably not a lot of companies will do that if they don't have to, because yeah, it's a lot of effort, and also then comes with cost, I guess. Okay, let's talk about different testing approaches when it comes to accessibility.
Yeah, so we know the legislation is coming. We also have benefits of our user base, but how can we best approach the topic? So generally speaking, we know a lot of these challenges that usually or probably also happen within your company, within your organization. The topic itself is very complex. You just heard about a lot of criteria that you need to check. These criteria itself are also kind of complex. You need a lot of understanding techniques to check this. So the main problems in general are the lack of knowledge of expertise for the topic of accessibility, but on the other side, also the lack of planning and the appropriate tooling. So for example, if you have a good workflow, standardized workflow, you probably need less knowledge about the specific topics. And please keep in mind, like the planning, and that you consider accessibility as a continuous task during your development workflow and not just a one-time shot. So if you're doing stuff, building new features, releasing new features, accessibility should always be a part of it. Otherwise, you probably, and also with the lack of knowledge, a lack of tool will result in a lot of cost, refactoring cost, and also lose of time. So the success factor in general for a good approach, a good plan, is to have the right tools with the necessary tools left for using these tools, and of course a plan how to approach. And on the next slide, there is kind of a plan based on our experience. So what should you do? What can you do? As a recommendation is like 3 phases in general. Testing is the core. So we need to test if we are compliant and what we have to do, and re-evaluate if we still do not have any problems. So there is a great possibility with automatic monitoring. So we can test some of the aspects, some of the criterias automatically, but not all of the issues. But it's a good starting point. It's a good foundational layer. The rest we have to do self-testing. So there are also good approaches. I will show some of these approaches, how to empower everyone, also without much expertise in the topic, also without the actual developer expertise, for example, to test and go through the criteria and understand if we have some problems for the users and within our applications. And then at the end, we always say, I mean, I also have a strong background in UX design. We want to build this for the user, and actually the legislation is also to support minorities and the users. So that's why we always recommend to include the users in the workflow as well. At the end, highly recommended also to get more empathy, that we should also test with people with disabilities, that we ensure that we're not just legally compliant, but also really support people with different disabilities to really use our product. But of course, in this order, so we first should check for critical problems before we test with real people with disabilities. And what is covered along this is like the scoping and the statement and the reporting, for example. So about the scoping, of course, we cannot test all of our hundreds of different pages, but like especially in Germany, and depending on your local enforcement of the European Accessibility Act, you probably can also have a look at the local legislation in Germany. It really clearly says which kind of pages are the most important to test. And this is quite logical, also from a user and from a business perspective. It's the main pages, so the start page. It's about the profile pages, so login and registration, and it's about the legally essential pages like contact information, terms and conditions, data privacy. So these pages have to be accessibility compliant in the priority scope. And then secondly, which is also quite logic, from a user and business perspective, it's talking about the essential user journeys. So basically the flows where you earn money as a company and where these private people spend their money. In a shop, it's probably the checkout funnel. In a restaurant, it's the booking workflow. So these journeys also needs to be accessibility compliant. And then, at least in the German legislation, it says, and it's a good recommendation, also for all kind of countries, that you check for significantly different pages. So usually you have kind of templates, modules, and technical setup. So if you cover the main pages, the journeys, you could have a look on which kind of pages, page types are totally different in the content and the functionality. And these pages should be your focus area for testing, because they also bring the added value. What is also a good tip for you is to use the accessibility statement. In Germany and also in the United States, Canada, it is required by law that you publish a statement, which is kind of a document on a page like the data privacy statement, where you just mention as a statement, hey, I take accessibility serious. I want to follow the WCAG 2.1 AA standard, and I continuously test my websites for this criteria. What is possible, like till June, if you still have some problems, you realize them during testing, that you can also mention this kind of problems here in the statement, so that people with disabilities already know, for example, the videos do not have captions at the moment. You're working on this and maybe update this later on, but these people then already know when reading through this statement, and they will do. We see this a lot in the testing. Usually people with disabilities check for the statement and they really know, okay, this part of the page, this contents are not yet accessible. I'm aware of this, but you will work on this. So it's a tool for you to mention existing problems at the moment during the transition phase, but it's also a good tool for the people with disabilities to know your current status of the site. So let's start with the first phase, automatic testing. So how can you do automatic testing? There's a lot of possibilities, free possibilities already built in your devices. For example, we have testing possibilities in the browser. I usually use Google Chrome with the inspect mode, the Lighthouse tool, which is baked into the browser. And there are also additional plugins available. And if you're a developer, designer, or part of a product team, there's also good possibilities during the creation process to test some of the criteria, for example, a design with Figma plugins, color contrast, touch target size, or within your development environment, your development tool, VS Code, something else. There's also good extensions, SDKs to do some basic automatic checks. But always keep in mind, we cannot cover all of the legally required and for the user required criteria just by these techniques. So what you have to do, we usually see and say that like up to 40% or 30 to 40% can be checked automatically, but the rest has to be tested by yourself as an expert testing with the right tools, or doing the user tests with people with disabilities. The best would be also to combine both of these methods to test. And I brought some video showing you how to test this. So what everyone of you can do, but you have to be aware of this. As mentioned, you have your device and you have your browser, and all of the accessibility functionalities are already baked into these devices, as people with disabilities also have to use this. So what you can do is turning on these settings, using the accessibility features on your own to test your websites for problems. So on the first hand, you experience yourself problems. On the other hand, of course, you can check for the compliance with your website and native apps. So, but you have to be aware how this is working. I brought a short video where I turned on the functionality for our website. So for example, you have the inspect mode, which is like a dev tool. There is the Lighthouse tool. You can run an automatic check, get a score about the accessibility problems. Then there is, for example, also a mode to turn on the high contrast mode that I was mentioning. So to see, hey, is all of the contents, all of the functionality is still visible? And then very common feature also baked into the browser, like increase the text size. And then also turning on voiceover. Marcus, I think we cannot hear. But usually you see like what is read out here is also, you can hear this, like the control, and the voiceover technology is also built in your device within your Mac or Windows machine, and you simply can turn on, learn about the shortcuts, and navigating through the sites by using these functionality.
Is your annual
Please select.
how many employees required list box pop-up collapsed combo box.
So what you can do, it's free for everyone. You can basically use these technologies to run through these checks to experience this, but of course, it's still quite complex to cover all of the criteria and be sure that you did not miss anything, because we have different kind of disabilities and criteria. And at the end, you also need to document all of these tests. So in a nutshell, there's a lot to do. We are aware of this. So we have 50 criteria. Then we have a lot of tools like the inspect mode, Lighthouse, focus, high contrast mode. So a lot of tools. And there is public documentation for all of the criteria, which tool to install, and additional documentation how to appropriately use these tools for testing all of the different criteria. So this results usually in a lot of work per page, also requiring some expertise for testing all this stuff. So this would mean theoretically a lot to do for us, and probably still we need expertise to go through this workflow. So and that's basically where A11YPLAN also comes in. So we also did a lot of these testings during the last years, and we realized, okay, there's so much waste of time in the efficiency of testing these workflows. We also saw, okay, we do not have an appropriate support for native apps, for example. Also, journeys like checkout funnels are quite difficult to test with this approach, and still accessibility testing is not really accessible. So you need to be an expert and to test your applications. And that's why we said, okay, the tool is the success factor. Let's think of creating a tool how to better test and easier testing websites. So this is one example with our tool, how you would define a scope. So basically you create a new testing scope, for example, a journey or simple screens. You can select which kind of platform you want to test, whether you want to authenticate with login or not. You can enter URLs, but you can also create recordings for URLs. So for example, if you want to record checkout funnel, you could start from this page and then use the different actions like a checkout, enter form fields and all the stuff, and define this as a scope for your testing. After you created the test, like on the next slide, then it's about the auditing. So what we wanted to do, we make the thing easy. So all of the pages in the scope that you checked for are available in the testing tool. We have all of the criteria with a simple explanation, so not too complex, not too technical, like here the focus state. You can emulate all the focus states, all the required states in the test, and easily select, for example, elements that are not meeting the requirements. And also with regard to documentation, you can directly document the findings in the tool and also annotate problems. And of course, we also have the possibility to come up with intelligent suggestions for fixing these issues. So it's quite simple. You cannot miss any criteria because everything is part of the tool that is legally required. You have all the states. You don't need any additional plugins, for example, for text zoom, for high contrast modus, and you can directly annotate problems within the tool. And the cool thing about this is like the third part, theoretically, like also from a legal perspective, you are required to generate a report at the end. So the cool thing about our tool that you do not have to create screenshots, copy over, creating PowerPoints, updating PowerPoints, but automatically generating a report based on your finding, also with metrics, how much violations, if you're compliant or not, qualitative findings with annotations in the screenshot. And the cool thing about this, you can easily share this with your team or with stakeholders and authorities if they ask you for what did you test and what are the results. So yeah, our intention is like really making accessibility more accessible and improve the workflow for testing and reporting, and do not waste too much time for this workflow. So that at the end, Marcos, we also have some time left for doing testing with real people.
Exactly. So, we have the three components that you mentioned, Marcel. So automated testing, manual testing, and now the last part, but also an important part, I would say, is about testing with affected people. And I would generally say that it's similar to user experience in general, right? So if you test all the functional aspects in your digital product, and you are fairly certain that there aren't a lot of critical issues left, that doesn't mean that the experience is actually a good one for the users, right? Because functionality is different to usability and user experience. So it's very similar in with accessibility. Just because you implemented the WCAG criteria properly doesn't mean that the experience for someone with a disability is necessarily a good one. So it does make a lot of sense to ask people about their experience, right? So generally, different people will have different setups at home. So they use different tooling, different assistive technologies. there's a lot of people with different kinds of disabilities, also temporary disabilities, and really to get a full picture, it makes sense to have a look at their experience and maybe ask them about it while they do that. So it does make sense to not typically when we talk to companies, there's a big focus on visual disabilities and blind people because that's somehow kind of the most prominent topic. But there's also a lot of people with other disabilities that need to be considered. So it does make sense to include people, with visual disabilities, but also auditory, motor disabilities, or movement, and also cognitive disabilities when it comes to content that's displayed and how understandable that is, for example. And then we can do two things with these people. On the one hand, we can do unmoderated testing formats where they get, for example, a questionnaire or they record a video and they share their experience with us. But they do that in an unmoderated way on their own. They would get use cases from us. So they get certain scenarios like, hey, you want to go to this website and buy a pair of jeans. We'll see example in a moment. And then they go and try to do that and they share how that works for them. The second thing that's possible is we do moderated formats, which is essentially interviews. So we set up interviews with people and we can follow along what they're doing because they will be sharing their screen. But we can also talk to them, ask follow-up questions, and kind of be there when it happens. So that's really useful to deep dive into certain topics and really get a deep understanding of what's going on. I brought a couple of examples what that can look like. This one is a study that we did some time ago with 10 people from different countries. And the interesting thing here is that it included both people with disabilities and without. Here there was a focus on visual disabilities, and the topic was tab functionality and what kind of color makes sense for the people. And what's interesting here is that, of course, just because something is accessible, it still also needs to be a good user experience for everyone else. So what you want to create is an experience that works for all, instead of focusing only on one or the other topic. So it does make sense to when implement accessibility or accessible features, that especially when it comes to design and so on, you consider your full audience and not only one or the other. And I had a client recently during an event last week who said, actually, this is a challenge for us because I'm afraid that we make it less usable for other people when we implement all of these accessibility features, which is relatable, but it's also solvable, for example, by doing a study like this. The second example here is the pair of jeans that I just mentioned. And this is an unmoderated setting where a blind tester recorded a video of her experience browsing basically this e-commerce shop. And I'll just play it and then explain a little bit afterwards what happened there. But keep in mind, this is a blind person, so she's not actually seeing anything that you're now seeing on the screen.
Okay, they show me a pair of jeans and I can see quite well what's up with them. The first time a menu and a shopping cart. That doesn't interest me at the moment. I have now skipped over the title page and can here select widths, sizes, these jeans, and so on, and read the description. And that is really well done. That's what I imagine as low barrier accessibility, where I quickly find my way around a page, similar to window shopping. Look for you so that I can first just calmly check things out and then also buy them.
Right, so this was kind of a positive example. You might have noticed that here there's a highlight when she's navigating through the page, which is something that Marcel, you mentioned earlier on. That's something that has to be implemented. And also she was hearing via a screen or voiceover kind of what is written on the specific button or in this description, and that was understandable for that person. So she said, that's actually how I would imagine it, and I can kind of I know what's being shown to me on this page. The second one is a little bit different, a bit of more of a negative example. Same situation, so also a blind person, and you can try to be on the lookout for these highlights and what she's talking about, and then we'll see how that goes.
Okay, is it at least structured? It is. The umlauts are not displayed correctly in Braille. Now, of course, a push notification pops up here. I certainly don't want that. Now I'm getting heaps of ads, also with ingredients. What I see here are a bunch of strange graphics, links with graphics. That could be recipes or could be normal links. And just buttons that are partially labeled, partially not. Here I see a media gallery at the bottom of the page where there are some pictures or some internal Instagram profiles are displayed. So overall, it is just a very complex page where you can't rely on it always looking somewhat the same. And graphics are properly labeled, or you also don't see these graphics that are only used as decorative symbols.
Okay, so I think the obvious topic here was that there's an issue with the descriptions of the images. So if you think back to the iceberg that we've seen in the beginning of the presentation, when it comes to descriptions, alt texts, and so on, it just basically tells her, hey, here's an image or here's an Instagram, but it doesn't actually describe what it is. So for her, it's impossible to understand what it looks like. There's also a couple of more subtle topics maybe that we can see. So on the one hand, there's no highlighting of her navigating through the page. And she also mentioned that the structure of the page is not consistent. So as a blind person, right, she quickly needs to go through each page and understand what is it and what do I see there. But if the structure is always different, it's very hard to get an understanding if you go through different pages, and it's very confusing. And that's also something that she mentions here, that it's not consistent across this page. So yeah, those were kind of two examples what it can look like when we do such a crowd test or a test with affected people, because we're not there talking so much about WCAG guidelines. We're more focusing on the real experience for users, and how that's then being implemented in practice is they don't really care so much, right? It's more important that it works. Like for any of us, when we go to a page and we just want to buy something and it doesn't work, it's just not a good experience. So summarizing real quick, and then we'll come to the questions already. We've talked about kind of these four parts that are important when it comes to accessibility testing. On the one hand, there needs to be kind of an ongoing monitoring, and that's possible if there is certain experience and knowledge internally, and you have the right tooling, right? So it makes a lot of sense also to look at it from a strategic point of view, have people internally trained on certain topics and integrated into your development strategy. So it's not just a one-shot thing, but it's something that also from an economic point of view only makes sense if you do it consistently in the process instead of once a year or every other year, and then you have a huge chunk of things that need to be fixed. That doesn't make sense also from an economical point of view. We have these three different testing methodologies or testing topics, the automated one, the manual one, and the user-centered one. And we've seen that it's important that there's a certain reporting happening that you can show and use for the accessibility statement on your website, for example. But also that's something that you can show if at some point in time you get a request from kind of a now I'm missing the word.
Authority, yeah.
Yes,
like
thank
official
you.
authority.
From the
or
authorities
lawsuit, yeah.
knocking on your door saying, hey, we've, for example, received complaints. Show us what you do when it comes to accessibility, and then you already have something. So that's kind of a quick wrap up maybe of what we talked about. I've seen some questions already. So thank you for listening so far. I hope you were able to learn something, or there were some interesting aspects in there. And I'll stop sharing in a moment so I can focus on the questions as well. And you see us maybe a bit better.
Yeah, maybe I can already start with the first one around mobile apps. So in general, Marcus, I think you mentioned physical products are affected by the European law. It's also native apps, so all digital touch points are affected. So it's not just websites, but also apps that need to be accessibility compliant. And for the testing purposes, just like as I mentioned, there are also like possibilities within the development environment. So the developers should be aware of the local functionalities. Both Google and Apple are offering some automatic checks, but also keep in mind you cannot cover all of this. I would rather say for native testing, it's lower. So more like 20% of the problems can be found automatically in these tools. And for the rest, you would need to do manual audits and testings. With A11YPLAN, we said, okay, it's the same setting. We also include native app testing for iOS and Android applications. So within our tool, you're also able to upload your test builds and then check for accessibility problems. Same with the automatic approach and the manual testing, including the reporting as well. But app testing is a little bit more complex. That's why there are not much like good tools out there in our experience.
Okay. Thank you. There was also another question when it comes to the video we just saw. The tester mentioned that Umlaut, so the kind of the funny German letters aren't displayed correctly or communicated correctly via her Braille keyboard. Marcel, is that so? The question is it something I have to ensure technically? I think if I understand the question correctly, at least technically on my product, and if so, what do I need to do there?
Yeah, you, I don't know the correct implementation, but it's definitely a technical problem. So you have to take care that you use the special characters with the appropriate setting and also translate this appropriately. So set the right language tags. In this case, probably not in English umlaut because it's not existing. Yeah, but use the right ASCII or technology setting for also writing content and also translating and setting the right keys so that the setting, the device setting, and the language setting of the users is directly knowing what it is about.
Okay, and you also mentioned some browser extensions in the beginning. The one question is whether we have specific recommendations for extensions.
Yeah, so the one that I was showing in the video is like the native thing. I usually recommend using the Chrome browser for the inspect tools. So there is great possibility for the Lighthouse check, which is basically an accessibility automatic check for the website that you're currently seeing, quite good. Then there is like the rendering functionality. The font size increasement can be done also within the browser. It's a basic setting that you can do on your own. And for the stuff that you do not see directly, I have not very specific recommendation for extensions, but I know about these JavaScript extensions that simulate, for example, like they're scanning for headings and checking for the tab order and visualizing this. But it's a lot of different extensions that you have to search and look for and install this. That's why also we said, okay, maybe we should think of building everything in one tool. But if you do like a quick research in Google for snippets, usually it's called accessibility snippets, you will find some good resources there.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, of course, because you can't say it so much, but I can say it. We would then also recommend a tool like, if you're really getting serious about it, a tool like yours from A11YPLAN, because that will cover a lot of the aspects that, or pretty much all of the aspects that you need, that you would get from such tools for free, and a bit more as well. So the recommendation would be also to play around a bit, I guess, and see, especially if you're starting out with accessibility, where do I stand at the moment, right? It makes a lot of sense to use these free tools and get an initial idea.
Yeah, and also keep in mind, like you have everything in your device, also VoiceOver. A recommendation is it's not like a tool for testing, but it's the real tool that people with disabilities are using. So it's a lot about simulating their context and their experience, and you have everything ready on your device. So feel free, always a good recommendation to get a more empathy for the topic. If you try this out on your own, maybe close your eyes and try to navigate and try to understand the context of your website with VoiceOver. A really interesting experience, but mostly horrible experiences. Most of the sites are still not really good based on our experience. Another question was how we can report app and websites in case of accessibility violations. So like the report itself, so basically what you're doing, you're checking all of the criteria. Is it met, or do we have violations? And if you have violations, you usually find the place on the page and the element, and you annotate, hey, this button, for example, is missing the appropriate label, or this text is with low contrast. So you have to check for all of the criteria, all pages and all elements. And if you're doing a documentation, you usually have to sum it up, maybe make screenshots and all the stuff. That's also one point that we covered within our tool, that you do not have to do this manually with PowerPoint bashing and Figma slides and all the stuff, copy over things from slide to slide. So we're generating this report during testing. So if you do the test, if you find a violation, it's directly part of the report, and you can share this report either within your team or with authorities then later on. But there is no official requirement how to document. The legislation just say, hey, you need to check for our criteria, and you need to document somehow what you did and what the findings are.
And maybe in addition, when it comes to the user perspective, right? So as a person, maybe that's also how, I'm not sure how that's, the question was intended, but from a user point of view, reporting violations will be different depending on where you're located. Similar to GDPR, for example. I personally would always recommend to first reach out to the company or the product itself, and just make them aware of it. Either they're not aware, they can fix it. They might be already in the process, and it helps them to get started a little bit. Or if that doesn't work, the second step then would be authorities. But I think it's a bit early days at the moment, because we also don't know yet exactly how the authorities will kind of deal with violations in the future, because it's very new, at least for the European Accessibility Act. Then there was another, or actually a couple of questions for your tool, Marcel. Maybe you can answer these real quick.
For the testing, so our ideal case is that we make accessibility testing accessible for everyone. So the main purpose of the tool is that it empowers everyone to test for accessibility. So ideally, you can test on your own. So you use the tool to check for all criteria within your platforms. But of course, like in urgent cases or at some points, you do not have the capacity. You still need someone to do the testing. We also support with accessibility testing as a service. Yeah, the main idea with the tool, as we also in the beginning built for ourselves, is to empower others to use it and test it. So you can do this on your own with a license. And exporting functionality, we're currently preparing because we get a lot of requests for Jira, and that you can also export the violations with a priority into Jira as a ticket system. But we also say like the report itself is a kind of a task board by itself, because we can run different cycles. So whenever you check your scope, you get a result with a shareable report. You can use this to fix the stuff based on the report. And once you're done, if your development team says, hey, I did quite a lot of fixtures, you just run another run, and then the violations that are fixed disappear.
And regarding the accessibility statement, that's also a question I've seen before, right? So are there certain templates, and where do we need to put it in the product?
Yeah, so there is a standard template that you can just copy maybe from our side or find publicly available. It's very simple. Just saying what you want to achieve, what you do for testing, and also mention the currently existing problems, and really important, contact channels within your company and contact channels to authority, especially in Germany. So this is the core content of the statement. There is no regulation what is essential, the format itself, but just the contents, like the contact channel and the barriers and the problems you should mention. And the location in Germany, maybe you have to check in your local legislation in Germany. In the legislation, it says it has to be easily accessible, either part of the terms and conditions or directly implemented in the footer. From a legal perspective, from a user perspective, we see this quite a lot with real user testing with people with disabilities. So they really use the statement to get an understanding for the compliance of the page. So that's why, from user perspectives, recommended to have a hidden link directly available in the header, so at the beginning of the page, which is directly redirecting you with the first tab to the accessibility statement. So maybe you can check this also with our website or with Google, for example. Other pages doing is like that. If you open a site and press 2 times the tab key, you usually see this link in the header showing the accessibility statement.
Okay, and there's a follow-up question around the contact options for authorities. So we
in Germany, there used to be one authority per state. So a lot of different contact persons. I think Germany is also managing to set up one central department to take care and coordinate these checkups. But this is really different from country to country, and not specifically required by law to mention this in your statement. What is really important that you mention your internal contacts. So if a person with disability has got problems, that they have something to approach. Yeah, there's one fallback, like the general agency or authority for Germany. But we also have in Germany one per state.
It's complicated, and I think in practice it'll also take some time to really like if we compare it to GDPR, right? There was a lot of confusion in the beginning in 2018. Nowadays, people know what they're doing. Some of it is helpful, some of it not so much. But I think that's generally what we can say is also with the statement. If you have one and you have kind of proper information in there also without a contract to the state, you're already much better than the vast majority of companies today. So you won't be a target of, for an authority, for example, because you're already doing well. And then you can just, once there's clarity, update something like contact information in the future. At least that would be my approach.
Yeah, and to sum this up, usually we say, hey, the legislation is for the people with disabilities. So actually, legislation is for protecting minorities. So if you include people with disabilities with user testing, you could also ask them what is the best approach, how to write a statement and where to place it. And then also from a legal perspective, authorities definitely will accept this and maybe also prioritize your efforts that you already included people with disabilities in your efforts.
Okay, I would say a couple of thanks for asking all of the questions. Just looking at the time a little bit, I think we can maybe cover the ones we have until now real quick, and then we would call it a day. And you can always feel free to reach out to us afterwards if you're interested. So the first one from Eugene, Marcel, is for you.
Yeah, so app view is considered one screen of an app, because an app, unfortunately, there is usually not this full page screenshot testing possible. So we consider one app view as what you see within one screen. If you have a long page, it probably consists of multiple app views. And the focus state accordion. Usually the focus state is covering what can be clicked or what can be pressed. An appropriate accordion is actually a button. There's also native accordion available in browsers, and this is usually the complete click area, including the arrow in most cases.
All right. Then, yeah, as mentioned, I think we call it a day. Thanks for participating, everyone, and also thank you for asking a lot of questions. It's definitely an interesting topic. We'll share the recording with you. Thank you, Volker, for posting that. And again, if you have follow-up questions or you want to learn more, just feel free to reach out, and we'd be happy to have a conversation with you. And last but not least, thanks, Marcel, for joining. As always,
Thanks, Markus.
my pleasure.
Thank
All right.
you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.